as we get closer to the NHL draft and the free agency period, there's still a lot of questions of how the Carolina Hurricanes are going to bolster their roster for 25-26. Now, we all know they got $20.4 million in cap, and they got 21 draft picks over the next 3 drafts. But the question is, should they keep them all, or should they be able to use them in their way to acquire talent now rather than the future? Well, let's get a wild, and let's take a look at how the Hurricanes can get Marco Rossi.
Your Locked On Hurricanes, your daily podcast on the Carolina Hurricanes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Thank you to the Everydayer for making this your first listen of the day. 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, talking everything about your Carolina Hurricanes. I'm your host, Zach Martin. I'm the credentialed Carolina Hurricanes beat writer over at the Hockey Writers, also the co-host of the Surgecast, which is a weekly Carolina Hurricanes podcast, along with all my duties here at Locked On Hurricanes. So on a Wednesday edition of the pod, we're going to look over at how the Hurricanes could find different avenues to go acquire Marco Rossi from the Minnesota Wild, as there have been reports of maybe there could be potential to acquiring him in some capacity, and why the Hurricanes should possibly be one of those teams to reach out to get him from Minnesota. Now, that being said, what are the avenues? Well, it could be the offer sheet, or it could possibly be a trade. Which makes sense, and what does that kind of look like in terms of the Hurricanes? And finally, if they do find a way to acquire him, where does he fit on the roster? Now, the thing with Marco Rossi and why this has been such a fascinating tale of what's going on with him is the fact that contract negotiations have kind of stalled between him and the team of, up there in Minnesota. They are looking to figure out how to keep him because he will be a restricted free agent this offseason. Now, that being said, he is offer sheet eligible, so the other 31 teams can go get him. Now, that begs the question, do Minnesota want to just try to hold on to him and find a way to keep him in Minnesota? Or, what team can blow the money with an offer sheet possibility, and can they match it? Or is there some trade capital going into that as well? So one thing that has been going on right now, and big things to Mark, Russo from The Athletic also covers the Minnesota Wild. The Wild have given Rossi 2 different options. One of them was a 5-year deal for $25 million. Now, that's a $5 million AAV, and that has happened this past winter. And there's been one in the last week or so that is a short term. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Rossi kind of wants somewhere near or north of teammate Matt Boldy's contract they signed back in January 2023 for his extension. That was a 7-year, $49 million deal, which is $7 million AAV. So that begs the question, is Rossi looking for 7, or is he looking to tad over 7, or is he looking at $8 million? So that's where a lot of teams have kind of inquired about him. And of course, Bill Guerin said he's not dying to go trade the 23-year-old Austrian forward. Now, that being said, why should the Hurricanes reach out to him? Well, main thing is the fact that the Hurricanes have been in need of a legitimate second-line center for the last few seasons. Nothing against Jesperi Kotkaniemi. He's a good defensive forward, but he is unfortunately not that guy who can be a 2C on the Hurricanes roster. He's more of a 3C, a third-line center. Problem with that is you have Jordan Staal as your third-line center, and there's no way Rod's going to move him and his line down to the 4th. So Jesperi Kotkaniemi is not – he's okay, but not a bona fide second-line center, and his play style doesn't fit a 4th-line center role. So he's kind of in that in-between spot of where he's just in a bad roster spot of being not being at the level that he needs to be for one, and his fit doesn't really work well on another line, and the spot that he needs to be in is currently taken by the captain. Now, he can play wing, but they've not really used him in that capacity. So getting Marco Rossi would be the choice of if they want to go get someone and have long-term control over, that's where he comes into a factor. And that's why I think the Hurricanes should at least go and inquire about him. Now, could it be an offer sheet? Could it be a trade? Well, in segment 2, we'll talk a little bit more about that of like what would be the better avenue to go down with. But for the fact that Rossi is looking at a big contract extension on his end, being going into his RFA season, the thing is with that, he just got paid $863,334 for his entry-level contract. The thing, too, and then he's going to be 23 this summer. The thing is, he just posted a 24-goal, 60-point season in his second full season in the league back in 23-24. In 82 games, he had 21 goals and 40 points. So in the last 2 seasons, he's played full 82 games both years. So you're talking 164 games over the past 2 seasons, and he's gotten exactly 100 points. So 100 points in 164 games is pretty good for a guy who was 23 or 22 last year, 23 this year. Top of that, he had 16 minutes and 44 seconds of average time on ice last season compared to this season where he had 18 minutes and 15 seconds per game, and his power play points and goals went up. 2 the year before, this past season had 7, 6 power play points up to 16, and his shooting percentage, 12.6 to 17.6. So you see a growth in Rossi's game. And I think the fact that how young he is and how good he already is, I think that should be a question. It's a good indicator of why the Hurricanes could look at getting a guy who would fit well within the young core of the Hurricanes that they already have. We're looking at Seth Jarvis is 23, Stajkovic 22, Andrei Svechnikov is 25, Sebastian Aho is only 27, so he's still within that range of those guys. Jackson Blake, Scott Morrow, Bradley Nadeau in the future. So adding someone like Marco Rossi is already bolstering a young, good, talented core and just adding another great, young, talented piece in the middle of that. And they can find a way to go get him in a certain way and give him a contract that fits within the window of everyone else where, Jarvis is going into a second year of his contract, which is 8 years. Then you got Jacob Slavin's contract, of course, more of a veteran guy, but his contract, his next 8 years kicks in next year. So Slavin and Rossi could be looking at that same range in terms of how that would work out. So if you're Carolina, you're going to get a bona fide second line center that you could put behind Aho. Of course, we'll talk more about roster fits and all that stuff in segment 3, but you're looking at a young guy who really wants to get money. He's asking for 7 or a little bit north of 7. Minnesota's saying we want to give you 5. That's a big difference. You're talking between $2 to $3 million difference on a guy who's just coming out of his ELC, but he just had a 60-point season. He's had 100 points in the last 162 games. That's pretty good for a young guy like that. And if the Hurricanes are able to make a trade that works or make an offer sheet that works, then there could be a play on where now you move off from just Barry Kotkaniemi as your second line center. And now Marco Rossi might be that guy. Like I said, his age works really well. And the fact that he's got the skills, we all know he does. He's an electric goal scorer. He's a guy who can make some great passes. He has a great game. I know the big question mark a lot of people are going to have is his height. He is 5'9". So to everyone who's like, we have enough short guys or shorter players on the roster. Yes, the Hurricanes do have guys like Logan Stajkovic, who's 5'9", Seth Jarvis, who's 5'11". Does it make sense to add Marco Rossi, who's 5'9"? Hey, man, if there's no chance you can get a bona fide second-line center who's that young, who's got a huge upside, and is only 23 and he's going to get better, I'm sorry, there's nothing wrong with going to get a guy who's a 5'9" center who is dynamic, because you always get bigger guys on the wings to help them out too. But are the Hurricanes in need of another shorter player? Not really, but if you get a dynamic talent like that in Rossi who can add something to your center core and can only get better from here, and he's already got 60 points in his second full season, that's not as bad about to be in. Now, that being said, how can the Hurricanes get them? Well, there are two options, and we'll talk about that here in a second on a Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. They're the satisfying crack of opening the shell. It's like a snack meditation. And whether if you're running in between meetings or dropping off the kids, the Wonderful Pistachios are the snack that works as hard as you do. So get snacking and get cracking with a snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Welcome back to segment 2 of Locked On Hurricanes, your team every day. Now, we kind of heard of why the Hurricanes should be reaching out to the Minnesota Wild about Marco Rossi, and if they do, what are the possible avenues that the Hurricanes could go in and require a guy like Rossi from Minnesota? Well, there are two options. Since he's a restricted free agent, it's more there you have the option of, it's not just they can go and just try to sign him. Unfortunately, that's not the case. They will have to possibly offer sheet for him. Now, the offer sheets have come out from the NHL. Of course, big things to Puckpedia for giving the actual dimensions of how much guys can go, teams can go, offer. What's the draft pick compensation to the other team if they don't match? The thing for the Carolina Hurricanes is, and this is for the entire NHL, it's not the current draft season that you have to worry about your picks for. It's the following seasons. So we're talking about the 2026 draft picks for the Carolina Hurricanes that they would have to use to go get Marco Rossi this summer. So you're talking one summer ahead, not the same one. That being said, the two possible options for offer sheets that the Carolina Hurricanes could go get a Marco Rossi is it's 1 second-round pick, $2.340 million to $4.680 million. Of course, there's some dollar amounts like 38 to 76 and stuff like that, but basically 2.34 to 4.68 with some dollars here and there would be the second-round pick. Now, the next option above that would have been a first and a third for $4.68 million with $77 to $7.020,113. That's the max. So they can go to 4.680076 for the 1 second. The next dollar amount, which makes it 0.77, that takes it to the first and the thirds. Problem with that for the Carolina Hurricanes is they do have their own first round pick for the 2026 draft, which does also include the Dallas Stars, but it has to be your picks that you go make an offer sheet for. The thing is, the Hurricanes they have a third. Unfortunately, it's not their third. It is the Dallas Stars' third that they picked up in the Logan Stankoven trade. Their 2026 pick for the third round, that belongs to the Utah Mammoth, which at the time was the Arizona Coyotes, and where the Hurricanes were able to get Shane Gostisbehere the first time he came to Carolina. So that trade that happened about a couple years ago it's coming to fruition, the fact that Utah owns that draft pick for the Hurricanes getting Shane Gostisbehere for that third. So that's kind of about it for that. So unfortunately, the Hurricanes can go do that 1 and 3, which would be a little bit better because there's a possibility they could have gone up to that $7 million range to get Marco Rossi. However, since that's not an option, the only other option with their draft picks available is something less than $1.544 million, which the Wild could easily match that with. The other option is 4 first-round picks for $11,700,193. Obviously, Marco Rossi is a great player, but he's not $11.7 million plus good to give up for 4 first-rounders. So essentially, the only offer sheet compensation the Hurricanes could go for is that one where it's a second-round pick between that $2,340,038 to $4,680,000 $1,076. That's pretty much about it in terms of the offer sheet situation. If it's a first, it's a 1 second round pick. Now, could Minnesota match that? They do have a little over $15 million in cap, so there's a possibility they could match that deal if it's just in that $4 million range. And it's only a second round pick. Now, what is a possibility, too, that the Hurricanes could go and trade for Marco Rossi's rights? Because we all know last summer with Jake Gensel, the Hurricanes traded him away to Tampa Bay right before the start of free agency and got a draft pick out of it. Now that gave Tampa the option to give him an 8th year possibly. For the Hurricanes in this situation, if they do go trade his rights before that date, they could pick up an 8th year option for Marco Rossi. Now, what does that look like to possibly get a trade-off to get Rossi and get his rights so they can possibly pick up an 8th year option to maybe drop the AAV a little bit, or how does that work out? Well, no one really knows the asking price. That's the thing. And like I said earlier in segment 1, Bill Guerin isn't really dying to move Rossi, but contract negotiations have stalled. Maybe potential trades have stalled. Who really knows? No one knows what's really going on in the Wild camp. No one knows what's going on in Rossi's camp. There's just a lot of rumors of they might move on from him, and teams are in contact with them. So what does the trade look like? Well, if you're the Carolina Hurricanes, you do have 21 draft picks over the next 3 NHL drafts. We're talking, in terms of the Kings, you got 2 first-rounders in 2026, 2 rounders in the 6th round of the 25 and 26 draft, and 2 picks in the 3rd round of the 27 draft. And then 2 other you got 2 other 1s, sprinkle of other 3s, 2 2s, stuff like that. So you have a lot of draft capital to go with. Now, the Hurricane with the Minnesota Wild this is where the draft picks really come in for the Minnesota Wild, and where I think the Hurricanes having so many of them could help them out. The Wild only have 4 draft picks coming up for this upcoming draft in 25. The Hurricanes have 6. And to be honest, with how log-jammed the talent pool is right now for the Hurricanes, they don't necessarily have to use all 6 draft picks from this season. And like I said, they have 21 other picks over for the 25, 26, and 27 drafts. Why not use them? Why not use them for an offer sheet or go and use them in a trade? You have all the draft capital. There's going to be teams who need draft picks. Minnesota's only got 4. Why not throw them a couple with a player and go get Marco Rossi? Now, could it be a Jesperi Kotkaniemi? Maybe. Could it be another guy of Rossi's talent range of could be an Unger Sorum? Could it be some other prospect? Scott Morrow, maybe. Could it be, I don't know about Jackson Blake, but there's some prospects that the Hurricanes could go trade for that kind of fit within the age range of Rossi if they want to throw some draft picks in there, or if they think Jesperi Kotkaniemi is just a guy who possibly needs a change of scenery, he could be on the way out too, and the Hurricanes could definitely throw some draft picks on top of that. So there's a lot of moving parts. It could be a Tampa's 3rd and Tampa's 6th, and maybe a Kotkaniemi for Marco Rossi. Or could it be one of the first rounders for the 26 draft and a prospect for him? There's a lot of different avenues the Hurricanes can go with in terms of a trade to where you go and get Rossi, and then you have his rights, and you got that possible 8th option, that 8th year option. So now you're looking at 7 or 8 years of having Marco Rossi in your lineup until he's 30 or 31. Now, what does that look like? Let's say if you do get the trade a couple draft picks away, you trade whichever player, Kotkaniemi, could it be Unger Sorum, whoever you want to throw in this trade. What would the next step after that be? Because you have his rights, he's an RFA. What type of contract are you looking at? Well, big thanks to AFP Analytics as always. I use these guys for articles and research and doing this. They're absolutely amazing. They have 2 different contract options for Marco Rossi. There's the short term and the long term. Short term, It is 2 years at $4.546 million annual average value, which would take up $4.76 million of the cap. His long-term option, $7.389 million over 7 seasons, which would take up $7.74 million of the cap. Now, if the Hurricanes have that possible 8th-year option, why not go 8x8? That's a possibility. You can go 8x8, or you can stick with that 7 to 7 point, deal with Rossi of that 7.389. You can do that. You have some options. But if the Hurricanes are able to go and use that, if they get that 8th option possibility, why not go 8x8? The guy's 23. He'll be 31 by the time the contract's over. He's going to have a good career. He's already shown that he's got that talent. Why not give him the 8x8? If not, you can still give him for that $7.7389 million. Either way, there are some potential contract options to keep Rossi long-term and build within that core that you already have. So like I said, there's 2 options. You can go offer sheet. Your best scenario there is the 1 second-round pick. Minnesota might match because it's only in the $4 million range. Or you go make a trade. You got the draft capital. You got some players you can possibly move on from. And now you get Marco Rossi as your second-line center, and then you go and extend him. Could be 7 years, could be 8 years, but there's a lot of potential avenues and a lot of different ways this could work out for the Hurricanes to get Rossi. Now, all that being said, let's just say it works out. They trade him, get his rights, they sign him. What does that look like on the Hurricanes roster moving forward? Well, stick around. I'll talk more about that here in a second on a Wednesday edition of Locked on Hurricanes. Welcome back to segment 3 of Locked on Hurricanes, your team every day. Now, we talk about why the Hurricanes should potentially reach out for Marco Rossi. What are the possibilities to get him via offer sheet or a trade and then an extension? If all that being said, what happens if they do that? What happens if they go and get Marco Rossi in some way? What does it look like for the roster? Well, obviously from the rip, he would be your second-line center. Yes, I know he's 5'9". Do the Hurricanes need another shorter player? It really depends on how you feel about that. With talent like that for Marco Rossi, you can go get taller guys in other parts of the lineup and put them on that line. It's about getting the guy who has a good skill set, who's only 23 and who's only going to get better. So you can find a way to get some height around him. But when you talk about skill sets and what he can do on the ice, guys who are in that height range can make it work. And I think Ross is one of them. So he'd be your second-line center behind Sebastian Aho. So now you would have Aho, Rossi, Stahl, and Jankowski. Depending on how that works out, and of course, what they're going to do with Spiro Kotkaniemi. But your center core would be those 4 guys. Aho, Rossi, Stahl, Jankowski. That is a great center depth. That's a great center core right there. And now your top 6 just got better because now you have Rossi in the mix. Now, if we're linking that to the previous episode where they go get Mitch Marner, now you're looking at a Svechnikov, Aho, Marner first line, and then as a potential Hall, Rossi, Jarvis second line. Now, yes, I know you're going to have a 5'11 Jarvis with a 5'9 Rossi, and then you're going to have Taylor Hall. A little bit of a shorter line, but a lot of skill there. A lot of skill on that line. You got a former MVP in Hall. You got a guy in Rossi who just had 60 points, which I haven't even mentioned yet. Rossi's 60 points would have put him third on the Hurricanes this past season, behind Aho 74 and Jarvis' 67. Rossi would have been the third leading scorer on the Hurricanes this past season. So having him with Jarvis, not bad, all things considered, when you're looking at possibly those 2 guys together. Yes, I know it's a little bit of a shorter line, but there's still a lot of skill there and a lot of two-way game out of those guys. And like I said, you're having an MVP player in Hall who's been known to throw some hits too and kind of, be that guy to, do what he needs to do. Not a bad top 6. when you're considering if you're adding Marner from, like I said, from Tuesday's show, and then having Aho Svechnikov, that's a great top 6 altogether. Then you go look at special teams. Like I said, Marco Rossi had 16 power play points and 7 power play goals this past season. He easily could fit on your second line of your second power play unit. So adding in Marner from Tuesday's show, Marner's on the first power play unit. You move Blake down to the second. Now you're adding Rossi as your second power play center, along with Stankoven, Blake, Hall, and maybe Chatfield, or insert defenseman here. Maybe Alexander Nikishin. Alexander Nikishin with those guys. Blake, Rossi, Stank. That's a great group. That's a great second. Now you're looking at a power play 1 unit that's going to have Marner, Aho, Svechnikov, Gostisbehere, Jarvis, then possibly Hall, Stankoven, Rossi, Blake, Nikishin. I think your two power play units just got a lot better just by adding Marner from Tuesday's show and Rossi in today's Wednesday show. Now your top 6 looks a lot better. Now the Hurricanes are pushing the envelope of going and loading up already. And there's still a lot more guys that could be targets for the Hurricanes if you kind of build this layer by layer, which we definitely will do as the show goes on through until we get closer to the draft and free agency. But if you're talking right now, just from Tuesday's show and today's show, you're adding Marner and now adding Rossi. You got your number 1 right winger who can score, make a lot of great plays. And now you got your second line center for the next 7 to 8 seasons, who's got a lot of upside. There's a lot to be excited about if you're the Carolina Hurricanes when you got a Marner Rossi on this roster. Very, very doable with how depending on how the contract situation works with Earl Schwartz. It's cap compliance manager. He's good at what he does. And then, of course, you've got the analytical brain geniuses of Eric Tolsky, Darren York, and the rest of the organization. So there's a lot to be said of going and getting those guys and making their contracts work. And now you're looking at, like I said, Svechnikov, Aho, Marner, and then Hall, Rossi, Jarvis. Or if you really want to flip that, Jarvis, Aho, Marner, Hall, Rossi, Svechnikov. There's a lot of avenues for that top 6 with those guys there together. And now you're looking at your top 6 and being really excited what that could look like if you're adding Marner and Rossi together in some capacity. Obviously, Marner for unrestricted free agency. Rossi as a restricted free agent could be an offer sheet. Could it possibly be a trade for his rights and then extend him for 7 or 8 seasons? All things considered, not bad business moves right there for the Carolina Hurricanes. But you know what? Let me know in the comments what you think. Should the Hurricanes even be considered in possibly reaching out to Rossi? If so, do you think that he would be a great fit in Carolina? And if not, let me know why you think he would be a great fit in Carolina. But if you're asking me, Rossi would not be a bad option as your 2C. And the fact that you could extend him for the next 7 or 8 years and fit within this core's massive window with all the great young talent they already have. Like I said, you got Svech, Aho, Jarvis, Blake, Stankoven, Nadeau's in the wings. You also got Nikishin, who's only 23. Pierre Kachekov only 25. And we're not even talking about the guys that you're, in their, later 90s, like Slavin, Walker, Ghost. You're looking at a window that could be pretty good for the Carolina Hurricanes if they go get Marco Rossi. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And like I said, we're still a good few weeks away from free agency and the draft and all that good stuff. But there should be a lot of things to get excited about for this offseason for your Carolina Hurricanes. Until then, this will be a Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Thank you for making it today. For your next episode, go check out Locked On NHL Game Night. Every game, every night until a Stanley Cup champion is crowned. Get local analysis on a national scale. Find NHL Game Night on Locked On NHL on YouTube or listen to podcasts. If you want to keep up with me, I'm at OneTrueZach on X. The podcast is LO_Hurricanes. I'm also on Blue Sky, the Zachary Martin, where you can check out my link tree in my bios, where you can find my written content at thehockeywriters.com. I'm also, if you want to check out my other podcasts, well, it's the Surge Cast on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. For Locked On Hurricanes, well, you can find us on Google, Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to your podcast. Follow, subscribe, leave a 5-star rating, so that way I can read it on the show. For YouTube, well, it's Locked On Hurricanes. Subscribe, hit the bell notification if you don't miss the show. Hit the thumbs up to let me know if you like the show as well. Share it with other Caniacs to become everydayers just like you. But hope everyone enjoyed the Wednesday edition of Locked On Hurricanes. Enjoy your Wednesday. And until next time, as always, let's go Canes.